Hello, and welcome to the channel. The story you're about to hear is about the moment when American fear became more powerful than American dreams. It reveals what happens when an entire industry turns its back on its brightest stars, and how quickly fame can turn to exile. How does a life built on applause survive in sudden silence? What happens to talent when all the doors close at once? Can a career, once destroyed by ideology, ever truly be rebuilt? Picture a soundstage at RKO in 1947. The golden light, the cameras ready, 100 crew members waiting. An actor arrives for work as they have 1,000 times before. But today, the security guard stops them at the gate. "I'm sorry," he says, not meeting their eyes. "You're not on the list anymore." In that moment, without trial or explanation, a life ends. Not through death, but through something perhaps worse: being erased while still breathing. This is the story of 10 actors who lived that moment. Stars who went from premieres to poverty, from leading roles to absolute silence, from household names to cautionary tales. Their crime, in most cases, nothing more than attending the wrong meeting, signing the wrong petition, or refusing to name names, when the fear finally came for them. The fear began quietly, the way most dangerous things do. In the spring of 1938, you could attend a party in Beverly Hills and find Humphrey Bogart discussing the Spanish Civil War with screenwriters who'd organized ambulance brigades for the Republicans. You could see Melvyn Douglas raising money for refugees fleeing fascism in Europe. You could watch Joan Crawford sign petitions for migrant workers' rights alongside directors and producers who believed that art carried responsibility, that fame meant nothing if it couldn't be used for good. This was Hollywood's popular front period, when progressive politics weren't just accepted, but celebrated. The studios themselves had backed anti-fascist films. Stars openly supported labor unions, racial equality, workers' rights. To be political was to be sophisticated. To care about the world beyond the camera was considered part of being a serious artist. But in Washington, Congressman Martin Dies was watching. He'd formed the House Committee on Un-American Activities in 1938. And Hollywood, with its wealth, its glamour, its influence over millions of Americans, seemed to him the perfect target. If you could control what appeared on screen, you could control what America believed. If you could silence the voices that reached into every small-town theater, you could reshape the national conversation. The first hearings came in 1940. But the war interrupted them. Americans needed to focus on defeating Hitler, not investigating their own citizens. For a few years, Hollywood's progressives relaxed. They dodged something, they thought. The danger had passed. They were catastrophically wrong. When World War II ended, a new enemy emerged almost overnight: the Soviet Union. America's ally against fascism, became America's existential threat. Anyone who'd expressed sympathy for socialism, anyone who'd attended meetings to discuss workers' rights, anyone who'd supported causes that Stalin also happened to support, they were now suspect. And actors, with their public faces and recognizable names, were the most vulnerable of all. Writers could work under pseudonyms. Directors could collaborate quietly. But actors, their faces were their fortune and their prison. You couldn't hide James Cagney or Barbara Stanwyck behind a fake name. When an actor was blacklisted, they simply disappeared. The machinery assembled itself piece by piece. HUAC reconvened in 1947, more aggressive than before. Private organizations began publishing lists of suspected communists and communist sympathizers, red channels, counterattack. These pamphlets, produced by former FBI agents, carried no legal authority, but functioned as judge and jury nonetheless. A name in red channels meant unemployment, no trial necessary, no appeal possible. The studios, terrified of boycotts and government investigation, capitulated immediately. In November 1947, 50 motion picture executives met at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. There, in that luxurious setting, they drafted what became known as the Waldorf Statement. They would not employ communists or anyone who refused to cooperate with HUAC. They would fire anyone currently employed who fell into those categories. The blacklist, though never called that officially, was now studio policy. The statement was practical, the executives insisted. Business, not politics. But they'd just agreed to let fear dictate who could work and who couldn't. They'd surrendered control of their industry to politicians and self-appointed watchdogs. They'd made cowardice official policy. For actors, this created impossible mathematics. Your entire career depended on visibility, on being cast, on studios wanting to use your face to sell their films. Unlike writers who could find other work or directors who could teach, actors had only their instrument, themselves. When the studios closed their doors, there was nowhere else to go. Broadway might hire you if you were lucky and if the blacklist hadn't spread there yet. Television was just beginning, but the networks watched the lists even more carefully than the studios did, and the accusations themselves were often absurd. Supporting civil rights made you suspect. Donating to Spanish War orphans in 1938 made you suspect. Attending a discussion about labor unions made you suspect. The definition of un-American activities expanded to include virtually any progressive cause, any criticism of inequality, any suggestion that American capitalism might not be perfect. The fear was bipartisan, all-consuming. Senators on both sides competed to appear toughest on communism. Newspapers ran front-page stories about Hollywood subversives corrupting American youth. The public, genuinely frightened of nuclear war with the Soviet Union, wanted someone to blame. Actors became convenient scapegoats, wealthy, privileged, easy to resent. But before the list existed, before the hearings destroyed lives, there were simply actors doing their work. One of them was John Garfield. Jacob Julius Garfinkel was born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1913, the son of Jewish immigrants from Russia. His mother died when he was 7. His father was a presser in the garment district, working 14-hour days for barely enough to survive. Young Jacob grew up on the streets, fighting, stealing, running with gangs. He might have ended up dead or in prison, but a teacher noticed something in him, an intensity, a presence that commanded attention even when he was just standing still. She got him into a program for troubled kids, and there he discovered acting. It saved his life. By his early 20s, he joined the group theater, that revolutionary collective that was inventing what would become method acting. He learned from Lee Strasberg and Stella Adler to dig into emotional truth, to find the character inside himself rather than performing from outside. He changed his name to John Garfield, American, simple, impossible to mispronounce. In 1938, Warner Brothers needed someone for Four Daughters, a romantic drama about a young musician. They tested Garfield. Jack Warner watched the screen test and reportedly said, "Sign him before someone else does." The film made Garfield an instant star. His character died halfway through, but audiences demanded him back. Warner Brothers brought him back as a ghost in the sequel. That's how powerful his presence was. People would accept supernatural absurdity just to see him again. What made Garfield different was his authenticity. He couldn't play aristocrats or wealthy businessmen convincingly. He played working-class men, immigrants, boxers, musicians struggling to survive. He brought his childhood to every role, the hunger, the anger, the sense that the world was rigged against people like him. In body and soul, he played a boxer who sells out his principles for money, then has to fight to reclaim his soul. The performance was devastating because you could see Garfield understood both the temptation and the cost. By the late 1940s, he'd formed his own production company. He wanted to make films that mattered, films about real people and real struggles. He wanted control over his career, independence from the studio system. That independence would destroy him, because John Garfield had never hidden his politics. He'd supported labor unions, civil rights, anti-fascist causes throughout the 1930s and 40s. He'd performed at benefits for Spanish Civil War refugees. He'd spoken publicly about racial equality at a time when that was considered radical. His wife, Roberta Seidman, was even more politically active. Together, they were everything HUAC feared: successful, influential, unapologetically progressive. The subpoena came in 1951. Garfield was ordered to appear before the House Un-American Activities Committee. They wanted names. They wanted him to identify other actors, writers, directors who'd attended meetings with him, who'd supported the same causes. They wanted him to betray everyone he'd ever worked with to save himself. He tried to thread an impossible needle. He admitted attending meetings. He admitted supporting various causes. But when they asked for names, he said, "I don't think so." Not a dramatic refusal, not a speech about the First Amendment. Just those 4 quiet words, "I don't think so." It wasn't enough for HUAC, but it was too much for Hollywood. The studios saw cooperation, not refusal. They saw someone who'd confirmed his political activities without clearing himself completely. The roles stopped coming. His production company collapsed. The industry that had made him a star turned its back completely. The stress destroyed his health. Garfield had always burned intensely, lived hard, felt everything deeply. Now he was unemployed, under constant investigation, watching his career disintegrate. His marriage fell apart under the pressure. He developed heart problems. Friends who saw him in 1951 and 1952 said he looked 10 years older, his face drawn, his famous vitality drained away. He died of a heart attack on May the 21st, 1952, in the apartment of a female acquaintance. He was 39 years old. The tabloids had a field day with the location of his death, suggesting scandal, implying moral failing. They couldn't let him die with dignity. Even in death, they needed to tear him down. His doctor said the cause was coronary thrombosis, but everyone who knew him understood the real cause. The blacklist had killed him as surely as a bullet. The stress, the humiliation, the destruction of everything he'd built, his heart simply couldn't survive it. John Garfield never lived to see his reputation restored. He never got to make another film, never got to prove he was more than his politics, never got to reclaim the career he'd earned through talent and work. He died believing he'd failed, that his refusal to name names had been for nothing. His daughter, Julie Garfield, spent decades fighting to clear his name, to remind people that her father had been a great actor, not a subversive. She wanted the world to remember his performances, not his HUAC testimony. But the blacklist had done its work too well. By the time Hollywood was ready to acknowledge its sins, John Garfield was 30 years dead, his films gathering dust, his name forgotten by everyone except those who remembered when refusing to betray your friends was considered more important than saving your career. Mady Christians was born into theatre the way some people are born into money or royalty. Her father was a prominent actor in Vienna. Her mother understood stagecraft like other women understood needlework. By the time Mady could walk, she'd spent more time backstage than in any nursery. The theatre wasn't her profession. It was her inheritance, her birthright, the only world she'd ever known. She trained in Europe, learning the classical technique that would mark her entire career. Perfect diction, elegant movement, an understanding of character that came from Ibsen and Chekhov rather than Hollywood. When she emigrated to America in the 1930s, she brought that European sophistication with her. Broadway welcomed her immediately. She had presence, intelligence, a voice that could fill a theatre without ever seeming to strain. Through the late 1930s and early 1940s, she worked steadily. Good roles, respected productions, the kind of career that doesn't make you wealthy, but keeps you working. Then, in 1944, she was cast as Mama in the original Broadway production of I Remember Mama. The role fit her perfectly. Mama was a Norwegian immigrant matriarch, holding her family together through love, wisdom, and quiet strength. Christians brought every ounce of her European training to the part, but also something deeper. Her own experience of immigration, of building a life in a new country, of carrying the old world inside you while learning to navigate the new. Her Mama was dignified, warm, unshakable. Critics adored her. Audiences wept. The play ran for 2 years. Christians performed Mama more than 700 times. The role became inseparable from her identity. When people saw her on the street, they called her Mama. When producers discussed future projects, they referenced her Mama. She'd created something permanent, a performance that would define her forever. RKO Pictures bought the film rights. Everyone assumed Christians would reprise her role. The part was hers. She'd created it, owned it, made it immortal. The film was scheduled for production in 1948. Then Red Channels published its list in 1950. Red Channels, the report of communist influence in radio and television, was a privately published pamphlet listing people suspected of communist sympathies. It had no legal authority, no governmental backing, no appeals process. 3 former FBI agents compiled it by reading old petitions, attendance lists from benefits, names on letterheads. If you'd signed something supporting migrant workers in 1938, you were in red channels. If you'd donated to Spanish Civil War orphans in 1939, you were in red channels. If someone else listed in red channels had mentioned your name in an interview, you were in red channels. Mady Christians was in red channels. Her crime: she'd supported refugees fleeing Hitler. She'd spoken out against fascism when fascism was actually killing people. She'd joined organizations that provided humanitarian aid to Europe during the war. In any sane world, these would be considered virtuous acts. In 1950s America, they made her unemployable. RKO gave the role of Mama to Irene Dunne. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that they were taking away the defining role of Christian's career. Dunne was a bigger star, they said. Dunne would sell more tickets. The fact that Dunne looked nothing like the Mama that audiences had fallen in love with on Broadway didn't matter. The fact that Christians had created the role didn't matter. Business was business. Christians tried to fight back. She took out a full-page advertisement in Variety, the industry trade paper. She denied being a communist. She listed her credentials, her patriotism, her American activities. She begged for the chance to defend herself, to clear her name, to work again. The advertisement changed nothing. The networks wouldn't hire her for television. The studios wouldn't cast her in films. Broadway producers, terrified of controversy, stopped calling. She was 58 years old, at the height of her powers, and suddenly unemployable. The financial pressure was crushing. She'd never been wealthy. Character actresses rarely were. She'd lived comfortably on her stage salary, but she'd saved little. Now there was no salary. Her savings evaporated. She couldn't pay rent. She couldn't buy food. She, who had stood on Broadway stages accepting applause from thousands, was reduced to asking friends for loans. The stress manifested physically. She developed severe headaches. Her blood pressure spiked. Friends who visited her said she seemed diminished, as if she were collapsing inward. She'd always carried herself with European elegance, but now she looked hunched, defeated, older than her years. On October 28th, 1951, Mady Christians suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. She died in a hospital, surrounded by the few friends who'd remained loyal. She was 58 years old. The industry she'd served for decades barely noticed. Variety ran a brief obituary. A few theatre people attended her funeral. But there was no major retrospective, no celebration of her career, no acknowledgement that a great actress had died. She'd been erased so thoroughly that even her death couldn't penetrate the silence. The film version of I Remember Mama was released in 1948, 3 years before Christians died. Irene Dunne received an Oscar nomination for playing the role Mady Christians had created. The irony would have been unbearable if Christians had lived to see it. Perhaps it was a mercy that she didn't. What remains of Mady Christians now? A few photographs, some old playbills, scattered references in theatre histories. The role she made famous is remembered, but she isn't. Mama lives on. Mady Christians is forgotten. The blacklist accomplished exactly what it intended. Not just unemployment, but erasure. Complete and permanent. Lionel Cornelius Kanagata learned about survival early. Born in Harlem in 1907, he grew up in a world where being black meant navigating constant violence, humiliation, and restriction. The city offered black men limited options: manual labor, entertainment, crime, or sports. Young Lionel chose sports. He became a boxer, fighting under the name Canada Lee, a name that sounded exotic, marketable, the kind of name that might get him noticed. He was good. Fast hands, smart footwork, genuine talent. He won the national amateur lightweight title. He turned professional, fought his way up the rankings. But boxing is brutal mathematics. In 1930, during a fight, he took a blow that detached his retina. He lost sight in one eye. At 23, his boxing career was over. A one-eyed ex-boxer from Harlem didn't have many prospects, but Lee had discovered something during his boxing years. He loved performing. The showmanship of the ring translated to the stage. He started taking small parts in Harlem productions, learning his craft the way he'd learned boxing, through repetition, observation, relentless work. In 1941, Orson Welles cast him as Bigger Thomas in the stage production of Native Son, Richard Wright's searing novel about a young black man destroyed by racism and poverty. The role was revolutionary. Bigger wasn't a servant, a comic relief, a noble savage. He was angry, violent, sympathetic, human, complex in ways that black characters almost never were allowed to be on American stages. Lee's performance was electrifying. He brought his boxing physicality to Bigger's rage, his Harlem childhood to Bigger's desperation. Critics who'd never seen a black actor in a serious dramatic role suddenly understood what they'd been missing. Here was an artist, not a stereotype. Here was someone who could carry a production on his shoulders. The film version followed in 1951. Lee reprised his role, though the script was sanitized for white audiences. Bigger's anger muted, his complexity reduced. Still, Lee's performance burned through the compromises. You could see what the character might have been in Lee's eyes, in his movements, in the moments when the script permitted him to actually act. Then came Body and Soul in 1947, where he played opposite John Garfield. Lee's character was a boxer, fitting given his background, but again, not a stereotype. He was intelligent, principled, a man who chose dignity over money. The chemistry between Lee and Garfield was genuine. They understood each other. Two men from similar backgrounds who'd fought their way into an industry that didn't want them. But Canada Lee's career was doomed by the same thing that made him remarkable. He refused to accept racism silently. He spoke out against segregation. He joined organizations fighting for civil rights. He performed at benefits for causes that challenged American inequality. He believed that his success as an actor carried responsibility. That visibility meant using your voice for those who had none. In the eyes of HUAC and its allies, this made him dangerous. Anti-racism, they claimed, was communist propaganda. Any black person fighting for equality was probably a Soviet agent using legitimate grievances to undermine American society. The logic was viciously circular. If you complained about racism, you were helping communists. If you were helping communists, your complaints about racism must be false. Lee was called before various committees. He testified calmly, explaining that fighting for civil rights wasn't communism. It was basic human decency. He refused to apologize for believing that black people deserved equal treatment. He wouldn't name names, wouldn't betray others who'd supported the same causes. The work stopped immediately. Hollywood had barely tolerated him when he was useful, but a defiant black actor was too dangerous to employ. Studios that had praised his performances now claimed he was difficult, uncommercial, unsuitable for their projects. The real reason was never stated openly. It didn't need to be. Lee tried to survive through radio work, using pseudonyms, hiding his identity to get hired. The humiliation was profound. He'd been on magazine covers, praised by critics, recognized on the street. Now he was sneaking into radio studios under fake names, hoping no one would recognize his distinctive voice. The financial pressure was devastating. He had a son to support. He had bills, rent, the basic costs of survival. His savings disappeared. He started borrowing money from friends, then from acquaintances, then from people who charged interest. The debt piled up. The stress became physical. By 1952, friends noticed he looked ill. He'd lost weight. He seemed exhausted, aged beyond his 44 years. The vibrant physicality that had defined his performances was gone, replaced by a kind of exhausted endurance. He was scheduled to testify again before yet another committee, this one investigating his tax returns, the government's favorite method of destroying people they couldn't otherwise prosecute. On May 9th, 1952, Canada Lee suffered a heart attack. He died that afternoon. He was 45 years old. His son, Carl Lee, would later become an actor himself, carrying on his father's legacy. But Carl grew up without his father, raised on stories of what Canada Lee might have been if fear hadn't turned courage into a crime. The blacklist didn't just destroy Canada Lee's career. It destroyed the possibility of what his career could have meant. A black actor playing complex roles, challenging stereotypes, proving that talent transcends race. Instead, he became a cautionary tale. See what happens when you don't stay in your place, when you believe that success gives you the right to demand justice. His films remain, flickering evidence of what was lost. In Native Son and Body and Soul, you can see an artist working at the height of his powers, commanding the screen, impossible to ignore. Then nothing. Silence. As if he'd simply vanished, his talent erased by fear. Revere was born into exactly the kind of family that wasn't supposed to produce radicals. Her ancestors arrived in America in 1630. One of them, Paul Revere, made his midnight ride into legend. She attended Wellesley College, that bastion of educated privilege. She had connections, breeding, the kind of background that was supposed to guarantee lifelong comfort and respectability. But something in Revere refused the comfortable path. She wanted to act, not socialize. She wanted to work, not marry wealth. She joined the theater in the 1930s, learning her craft in repertory companies, taking whatever roles she could get. By the 1940s, she'd developed a specialty: strong maternal figures, women of principle and backbone. She played mothers in The Song of Bernadette, National Velvet, Gentleman's Agreement, roles that required dignity without sentimentality, strength without hardness. Her performance in National Velvet earned her the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in 1945. Picture that moment, walking onto the stage at Grauman's Chinese Theatre, accepting the Oscar, hearing the applause. She was 42 years old, at the peak of her profession, earning $3,000 per week, equivalent to roughly $50,000 in modern money. She was one of the most respected character actresses in Hollywood, the kind of performer that elevated every film she appeared in. Studios wanted her constantly. Her name on a cast list meant quality, prestige, the kind of production that critics would take seriously. She could choose her roles, negotiate her fees, work with the best directors. She had achieved what every actor dreams of: security, respect, artistic fulfillment. The subpoena arrived in 1951. She was ordered to appear before the House Un-American Activities Committee. They had questions about her political activities, the organizations she'd joined, the causes she'd supported. They wanted her to confirm or deny, to explain herself, to prove her loyalty. Anne Revere chose the Fifth Amendment. She refused to answer questions on the grounds that her testimony might incriminate her. This was a constitutional right, clear and unambiguous. But HUAC and the public interpreted the Fifth as an admission of guilt. If you weren't guilty, why wouldn't you answer? If you had nothing to hide, why hide behind legal technicalities? The logic was deliberately poisonous. Answering questions meant either naming names, betraying everyone you'd ever worked with, or confirming your own political activities, which would get you blacklisted anyway. The Fifth Amendment was the only option that didn't require betrayal. But using it destroyed you just as thoroughly as confession would have. For Anne Revere, the destruction was immediate and absolute. The studios stopped calling. Her agent stopped getting offers. Projects she'd been attached to found other actresses. She went from $3,000 a week to nothing overnight. Unlike John Garfield, Mady Christians, and Canada Lee, Anne Revere didn't die. She survived the blacklist by returning to the stage. Broadway was more resistant to the blacklist than Hollywood, partly because theatre operated on smaller budgets and didn't fear boycotts as much, partly because the New York theatre community was more politically liberal than the Los Angeles film industry. But stage work paid a fraction of what films did. Revere went from being wealthy to barely surviving. She taught acting classes. She took small parts in off-Broadway productions. She did whatever work she could find, always under the shadow of the blacklist, always knowing that her Oscar meant nothing now, that her talent had been deemed less important than her politics. The 20-year exile gave her time to think about what had happened, to process the betrayal. She'd won Hollywood's highest honor, and Hollywood had discarded her without hesitation. The industry that had celebrated her in 1945 had erased her by 1952. Not because her talent had diminished, not because audiences didn't want her, but because she'd refused to participate in political theatre disguised as patriotism. In the early 1970s, as America began to reckon with McCarthyism's excesses, Anne Revere started getting film offers again. Small roles, supporting parts, the kind of work that any competent actress could get. She was nearly 70 years old. The roles she got were grandmothers, elderly neighbors, brief appearances that required her to be old and harmless. She took the work. She needed the money, and perhaps she needed to prove to herself that she could still act, that the blacklist hadn't destroyed her craft along with her career. But the momentum was gone forever. She'd been an Oscar winner on an upward trajectory, headed toward even better roles, greater recognition. The blacklist had frozen her career in 1951, and when it thawed in 1970, she was too old to reclaim what she'd lost. She gave interviews in her final years, and her tone was measured, careful. She didn't express regret for taking the Fifth Amendment. She didn't apologize for her political beliefs. But you could hear the loss in her voice, the awareness of what might have been. How many great performances had she never given because she'd been unemployable for 20 years? How many roles had gone to other actresses, roles she would have made transcendent? Anne Revere died in 1990 at the age of 87. Her obituaries mentioned the Oscar, the blacklist, the long silence. But they couldn't capture the central tragedy. That talent and achievement meant nothing when fear demanded conformity. She'd done everything right, worked hard, honed her craft, achieved the highest recognition her profession could offer, and it hadn't protected her at all. The Academy never apologized to her. They never acknowledged that they'd honored her 1 year and abandoned her the next. Her Oscar sits somewhere, probably in a descendant's home, a golden reminder that success is conditional, that approval can be revoked, that courage costs everything. The blacklist had no office, no official headquarters, no government seal. There was no master list kept in a vault somewhere, no bureaucrat stamping names with red ink. This was its genius and its horror. It operated through whispers, implications, the careful checking of names against privately published pamphlets. It was everywhere and nowhere, impossible to fight, because it didn't officially exist. The mechanism worked like this. A network executive sits at his desk in 1951. A script crosses his desk, a proposal for a new television drama. The producer has submitted a cast list. The executive opens his desk drawer and pulls out a thin pamphlet. Red Channels, the report of communist influence in radio and television. He runs his finger down the cast list, checking each name against the pamphlet. 3 names appear in Red Channels. The executive picks up his phone, calls the producer. "I need you to recast these 3 roles," he says. He doesn't say why. He doesn't need to. The producer knows. He recasts immediately, without argument, without asking questions. The 3 actors whose names appeared in Red Channels never know they were considered for the roles. They just know the phone isn't ringing. Red Channels was published in June 1950 by a private company called American Business Consultants, run by 3 former FBI agents. They'd compiled 151 names by reading old petitions, checking attendance lists at benefits and rallies, noting who'd sponsored refugees or supported labor unions. Their evidence was often decades old, frequently second-hand, sometimes simply wrong. It didn't matter. Once your name appeared in Red Channels, you were unemployable. Counterattack, another publication by the same company, operated similarly. It sent newsletters to advertisers and networks, warning them about performers with questionable backgrounds. The publication had no legal authority, no governmental backing. It was just 3 men with a mailing list and a file cabinet. But sponsors feared boycotts, and networks feared losing sponsors. So counterattack's word became law. The House Un-American Activities Committee provided the theatrical element. The hearings were public, covered by newspapers and newsreels. Witnesses were called, sworn in, questioned about their political beliefs and associations. The committee demanded names. Who else attended that meeting? Who else signed that petition? Who else supported that cause? Some witnesses cooperated. Sterling Hayden, the actor who'd been a genuine war hero, named names to save his career. He identified people he'd known in the Communist Party, people who'd attended meetings with him, people who'd trusted him. He kept working. Years later, he would call his testimony the most shameful thing he'd ever done. But by then, the damage was permanent. Elia Kazan, the brilliant director, also named names. 8 people, identified publicly, their careers destroyed by his testimony. Kazan justified it as patriotism, as choosing America over ideology. He continued making masterpieces On the Waterfront, East of Eden, while the people he'd named disappeared into obscurity. In 1999, when he received an honorary Oscar, half the audience refused to applaud. Lee J. Cobb, another group theater veteran, held out for years. He took the Fifth Amendment initially, suffered through the blacklist, watched his career collapse. Finally, in 1953, broken by poverty and isolation, he went back to HUAC and named names. 20 people. He got his career back, but friends said the guilt never left him. For those who refused to cooperate, there was supposedly a path back, the clearance process. Private firms, often run by former FBI agents, offered to clear blacklisted performers for a fee. The process involved meeting with these ex-agents, confessing your political sins, expressing remorse, and sometimes providing names. If the clearance firm was satisfied with your repentance, they'd contact the networks and studios on your behalf. Some cleared names worked again. Others found that even after clearance, the taint remained. Studios didn't want to take risks. Why hire someone controversial when hundreds of uncontroversial actors were available? The economic machinery was brutally simple. Advertisers didn't want their products associated with controversy. Networks didn't want to lose advertisers. Studios didn't want to lose distribution deals with networks. Everyone in the chain was motivated by fear of boycotts, investigation, or simply being associated with the wrong people. And the public largely supported it. Newspapers ran articles about Hollywood communists corrupting American values. Politicians competed to appear toughest on subversion. The Cold War was real, the nuclear threat was real, and in that climate of genuine fear, destroying a few actors' careers seemed like a reasonable price for national security. The blacklists' reach extended beyond Hollywood. Academics lost teaching positions. Musicians couldn't get bookings. Writers published under pseudonyms if they could publish at all. But actors faced unique vulnerability. Their faces were their product, impossible to disguise, impossible to separate from their work. The lists were never static. Names were added constantly, based on new information, old associations, rumors. A person could be working steadily 1 month and unemployable the next, never knowing what they'd been accused of or who had accused them. There was no due process, no chance to face your accuser, no appeal. Some tried to fight back through the courts. Few succeeded. How do you sue an unofficial blacklist? How do you prove damages when no one will admit they're discriminating against you? Studios claimed they simply weren't interested in hiring you. Networks said you weren't right for their programming. No one ever said, because you're blacklisted, because officially, the blacklist didn't exist. This was the machinery that destroyed lives, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet erasure. Phone calls not returned, meetings cancelled, roles going to other people. Until one day, you realized you hadn't worked in months, then years, and no one would tell you why. But before the machinery ground them down completely, there were actors who found ways to survive. One of them was Jeff Corey. Jeff Corey was born in Brooklyn in 1914, one of those New York kids who grew up on the streets, learning early how to read people, how to adapt, how to survive. He wasn't particularly handsome, wasn't leading man material, but he had a face that directors remembered. Angular, expressive, capable of suggesting intelligence or menace or desperate need depending on what the role required. By the 1940s, he'd built exactly the kind of career that character actors dream of. Steady work, good roles, recognition within the industry. He appeared in 40 films between 1941 and 1951. Westerns, noir, war pictures. He played sheriffs and outlaws, soldiers and civilians, authority figures, and desperate men. He was in The Killers with Burt Lancaster, Home of the Brave dealing with racial issues, Rawhide with Tyrone Power. Directors knew they could cast him and he'd deliver a solid, professional performance every time. He specialized in a particular type, the man with something to hide, the authority figure with questionable motives, the villain who believed he was the hero. His face could shift from friendly to threatening in an instant, which made him valuable in an era when westerns needed complex antagonists and film noir needed morally ambiguous characters. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. Character actors didn't become stars, but they worked constantly. While leading men worried about maintaining their looks and popularity, character actors aged into new roles, worked into their 60s and 70s. Jeff Corey was on track for that kind of career. Decades of steady employment, hundreds of roles, a comfortable living doing work he loved. Then Sterling Hayden and Lee J. Cobb named him before HUAC. Both men, broken by the blacklist, had gone back to testify again. They'd held out as long as they could, but eventually poverty and isolation wore them down. When they finally cooperated with HUAC, they brought names, lots of names, friends, colleagues, people they'd worked with years earlier. Jeff Corey's name came up in both testimonies. The work stopped immediately. One day he was a working actor. The next he couldn't get hired anywhere. His agent stopped calling. Casting directors who'd used him for years suddenly had no roles available. The last film he appeared in was released in 1951. Then nothing. 14 years. From 1951 to 1965, Jeff Corey didn't appear in a single film. He was 47 when the blacklist hit, 61 before he worked in movies again. For most actors, that would have been the end. Too old to restart a career, too broke to survive without work, too defeated to keep trying. But Corey found an alternative path, partly by accident. He'd always been interested in the craft of acting itself, in how performances were built, how actors found truth in scenes. During his working years, younger actors had sometimes asked him for advice. He was good at explaining technique, at breaking down what made performances work or fail. Now, unemployed and needing income, he decided to teach. He rented a small space and put out word that he was offering acting classes. The first students were friends, other blacklisted performers looking for something to do. But word spread. Young actors heard about this character actor who really understood the craft, who could help them develop their skills. The class grew. Corey discovered he loved teaching, maybe even more than acting. As a performer, you interpret someone else's words, fit yourself into roles created by writers. As a teacher, you help people discover their own instrument, their own truth. It was creative in a different way, fulfilling in a way that playing another sheriff in another Western had never been. His students started getting work, and they told other aspiring actors about him. Soon, Corey's classes included people who would become major stars. Jack Nicholson studied with him. So did Robert Towne, who'd become one of Hollywood's greatest screenwriters. Jane Fonda took his classes. James Dean attended before his brief, brilliant career. Corey taught them the same things he'd learned in his decades of working. How to listen, how to react truthfully, how to find the character's reality rather than indicating emotion. He was tough, but supportive, demanding but patient. His students loved him because he treated acting as a craft worth respecting, not just a ticket to fame. In 1965, the blacklist was finally weakening. The paranoia had subsided. Studios were willing to take risks again. Corey started getting offers, small roles, supporting parts. Nothing like his pre-blacklist career. He took them gratefully, happy to work again after 14 years. But he kept teaching. The classes had become more important to him than his own career. When his former students became successful, Nicholson winning Oscars, Towne writing Chinatown, they hired Corey for small roles in their films. It was their way of honoring him, of acknowledging what he'd given them during his exile. Corey worked steadily through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, mostly in television, occasionally in films. He never regained the momentum of his 1940s career, never became more than a working character actor again. But he'd found something the blacklist couldn't destroy. A different way to practice his craft, a different kind of impact on the industry. In interviews late in his life, Corey rarely expressed bitterness about the blacklist years. He'd talk instead about his students, about the satisfaction of seeing them succeed, about how teaching had enriched his understanding of acting. He'd survived not by fighting the blacklist directly, but by finding an alternative path, by turning exile into opportunity. He died in 2002 at age 88, still teaching almost until the end. His legacy wasn't the 40-some films he'd made in the 1940s, films that most people had forgotten. His legacy was Jack Nicholson's range, Robert Towne's understanding of character, the dozens of actors he'd trained who carried his lessons into their own work. The blacklist had destroyed his career, but it hadn't destroyed him. That distinction mattered. When the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences created the Best Supporting Actress category in 1936, Gale Sondergaard was the first person to win it. The award was for her role in Anthony Adverse, where she played a cunning, manipulative woman with elegance and intelligence. Standing on that stage, accepting the first ever supporting actress Oscar, she must have believed she was making history, securing her place in Hollywood's permanent record. She was right about the history, wrong about the security. Sondergaard had a distinctive presence, tall, with sharp features and dark eyes that could suggest mystery, danger, or sophistication depending on the role. She specialized in exotic, often sinister characters, the scheming woman in period dramas, the mysterious foreigner, the elegant villain. In an era when most women in films were ingenues or mothers, Sondergaard carved out a niche playing intelligence and complexity, even when that intelligence was malevolent. Through the late 1930s and 1940s, she worked constantly. She appeared in the life of Emile Zola Juarez, the Sherlock Holmes films, where she played sinister villains opposite Basil Rathbone. She was in The Letter with Bette Davis, holding her own against one of Hollywood's greatest stars. Directors valued her professionalism, her ability to elevate material, her distinctive look that made her memorable even in supporting roles. She was married to director Herbert Biberman, a successful filmmaker and member of the Directors Guild. They were a Hollywood power couple, not A-list, but respected, working, financially comfortable. They attended the right parties, knew the right people, had the kind of life that seemed permanent. Herbert Biberman was also politically active, increasingly so through the 1940s. He joined organizations, signed petitions, spoke publicly about workers' rights and social justice. When HUAC began its investigations, Biberman was among the first called. He became one of the Hollywood 10, the group that refused to cooperate with HUAC and was cited for contempt of Congress. In 1950, Herbert Biberman was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison. Sondergaard watched her husband led away to serve time for refusing to answer questions about his political beliefs. The punishment was meant to intimidate others, to show what happened when you defied HUAC. It worked. Sondergaard's career ended the day her husband was sentenced. She hadn't been called before HUAC herself. She hadn't been named in red channels. Her crime was being married to a convicted man, guilt by association, punishment for loving someone who'd made himself an enemy of the state. The studios stopped calling. Her agent stopped submitting her for roles. She went from working actress to unemployable overnight, not because of anything she'd done, but because of who she'd married. She tried to fight back. In 1951, she took out a full-page advertisement in Variety, Hollywood's trade paper. She denied being a communist. She proclaimed her patriotism, her love of America, her commitment to democratic values. She begged for the chance to work again, to clear her name, to prove her loyalty. The advertisement cost her money she couldn't afford and accomplished nothing. The industry didn't care about her denials. She was tainted by association, and taint didn't wash off through public declarations. The message was clear. You couldn't remain married to a blacklisted man and expect to work. If she wanted to save her career, she'd have to divorce him. She refused. Whatever else you could say about Gale Sondergaard, she was loyal. Her husband had gone to prison for his principles. She wouldn't abandon him to save her career. They stayed married, lived together through the long years of unemployment, survived on savings that slowly evaporated. 20 years passed, from 1951 to 1969. Gale Sondergaard appeared in no films. The woman who'd won the first ever supporting actress Oscar was completely erased from the industry. Younger people in Hollywood didn't even know who she was. Her Oscar sat somewhere, a relic of a career that seemed to have never existed. In 1969, she finally got an offer. A small role in a low-budget western, The Return of Jesse James. She was 70 years old. The role was nothing like the elegant villains she'd played in her prime. But she took it. She needed the work, needed to prove to herself that she could still act, that the 20-year exile hadn't destroyed her craft. A few more small roles followed through the 1970s. Television guest spots, minor film parts, the kind of work any competent elderly actress could get. Nothing that utilized her particular talents. Nothing that acknowledged who she'd been. Just work, which was more than she'd had for 2 decades. In interviews during her final years, the bitterness was palpable. She never forgave Hollywood for abandoning her. She never accepted the industry's half-hearted attempts at rehabilitation. She'd been first, the first supporting actress Oscar winner, and the industry had destroyed her without hesitation, without apology, without even the courtesy of explaining why. Herbert Biberman, her husband, eventually directed Salt of the Earth in 1954, a film about Mexican-American miners on strike. It was blacklisted itself, banned from most theaters, barely seen. But it survived, became recognized years later as an important film about labor and racial justice. His career had an afterlife, a vindication. Sondergaard's career just ended. There was no vindication, no rediscovery, no retrospective appreciation. She was a footnote, the answer to a trivia question. Who won the first supporting actress Oscar? Most people who knew the answer didn't know anything else about her. She died in 1985 at age 86. The obituaries mentioned the Oscar, the blacklist, the long silence, but they couldn't capture the specific cruelty of her situation. Punished not for her own actions, but for refusing to abandon her husband, erased from an industry that had once celebrated her as historic. The Oscar remains part of Academy history, the first supporting actress winner, enshrined in the record books. But Gale Sondergaard herself was forgotten, which was exactly what the blacklist intended. Not just unemployment, not just poverty, but complete erasure, as if she'd never existed at all. Howard Da Silva was born Harold Silverblatt in Cleveland in 1909, another child of Jewish immigrants making their way in America. Like so many actors of his generation, he found his way to the group theater in New York during the 1930s, that revolutionary collective where Lee Strasberg and Stella Adler were inventing what would become known as method acting. The group theater training changed how actors approached their craft. Instead of external performance, learning lines, hitting marks, projecting emotions for the back row, the method emphasized internal truth. You found the character inside yourself, drew on your own experiences and emotions, lived the role from the inside out. It was psychologically demanding, artistically rigorous, and it produced some of the most powerful performances in American theatre history. De Silva absorbed this training completely. He brought emotional intensity to every role, even small ones. He had a distinctive look, not handsome in conventional ways, but compelling, with a strong voice and physical presence that commanded attention. By the time he moved to Hollywood in the early 1940s, he was a fully trained actor with a specific skill set. He could inhabit complex characters, find their emotional truth, make audiences believe in people who existed only on paper. Hollywood put those skills to work immediately. He appeared in dozens of films through the 1940s. The Lost Weekend, The Blue Dahlia, 2 years before The Mask. He specialized in noir films where his intensity worked perfectly for corrupt cops, desperate criminals, men pushed to their limits. His face suggested someone who'd lived hard, seen too much, carried secrets. Directors trusted him with complicated roles that required more than just reading lines. He balanced film work with Broadway, never abandoning the stage, even as Hollywood offered more money and wider recognition. He understood that theatre kept his craft sharp, that 8 performances a week in front of a live audience demanded a different kind of discipline than film work. He was building toward a long career, the kind where you work into old age, become a respected elder statesman of American acting. In 1951, HUAC called him to testify. He refused to cooperate, refused to name names, refused to play the game. The consequences were immediate and devastating. He was literally removed from a film mid-production. Slaughter Trail had already started shooting. De Silva had completed several scenes. Then the blacklist hit, and the studio pulled him from the film. They reshot all his scenes with another actor, erasing him from the production as if he'd never been there. Imagine that experience. Showing up to work, being told you're fired, watching another actor step into your role, knowing that your work would be destroyed, that audiences would never see your performance. His film career ended that day. From 1951 forward, Howard De Silva appeared in no Hollywood productions for more than a decade. All the training, all the work, all the carefully built reputation, gone. The industry that had valued his intensity now considered him unemployable. But De Silva had an advantage that purely film actors didn't: his theatre training and connections. He retreated to Broadway, where the blacklist operated less absolutely. Theatre producers were more independent than film studios, less vulnerable to advertiser pressure, more willing to take risks. The New York theatre community, more politically liberal than Hollywood, was more resistant to blacklisting. He kept working on stage through the 1950s, though always under the cloud of the blacklist, always aware that television and film were closed to him, always knowing that half the industry considered him a pariah. The roles were good, the work was steady, but it was a fraction of what his career should have been. The artistic cost was profound. Method acting requires practice, demands regular work, needs the repetition of performance to stay sharp. Film acting, with its multiple takes and close-ups, requires a different technical skill set than stage work. By being locked out of films for over a decade, De Silva lost the opportunity to develop and refine those skills during what should have been his prime years. In the mid-1960s, as the blacklist weakened, he started getting film offers again. Small roles, supporting parts. Nothing like his pre-blacklist career. He took them, grateful to work in film again after so many years. But the momentum was gone, the trajectory broken. He was in his 50s, too old for the roles he would have played in his 40s, not old enough yet for the elderly character parts. The irony came in 1972 when he was cast as Benjamin Franklin in both the stage and film versions of 1776. Here was Howard Da Silva, once accused of being un-American, playing one of the founding fathers, singing about independence and liberty. You couldn't construct a more perfect irony. The man deemed too dangerous for Hollywood in 1951, embodying American patriotism in 1972. His performance was excellent, warm, wise, witty, everything you'd want from a founding father. Critics praised him. Audiences loved him. But by then he was in his 60s, and 1776 would be his most remembered role, overshadowing all the noir performances, all the intense character work he'd done in the 1940s. In later years, friends and colleagues noticed he struggled with depression and alcohol. The blacklist years had taken their psychological toll, being literally erased from a film, being told your talent was less important than your politics, watching younger actors get the roles you should have had. That kind of rejection damages something fundamental. He continued working into the 1980s, primarily in television. Still a solid professional actor, but there was always the sense of what might have been. If the blacklist hadn't interrupted his career at its peak, if he'd been allowed to develop his craft continuously from his 30s through his 60s, what kind of body of work might he have created? Howard Da Silva died in 1986 at age 76. His obituaries mentioned the blacklist, 1776, his group theatre training. But they couldn't fully convey the specific loss. A method actor prevented from practicing his method for a decade. An artist denied the opportunity to grow and develop during his prime years. The blacklist didn't just take away work. For actors trained in the method, actors who understood their craft as a lifelong practice requiring constant refinement, the blacklist took away something more fundamental, the ability to be an artist. That loss couldn't be measured in dollars or counted in roles. It was a theft of vocation, of purpose, of the thing that made life meaningful. And no amount of later success could restore what those years had taken. Karen Morley was born Mildred Linton in 1909 in Ottumwa, Iowa, to a family of considerable wealth and social standing. She wasn't supposed to become an actress. Women of her background became wives, mothers, pillars of their communities. They managed households, served on charitable boards, lived lives of comfortable respectability. Acting was for people who needed the money, people without other options. But Mildred Linton wanted something more than what Iowa society offered. She wanted art, drama, the chance to create something beyond domestic routine. Against her family's wishes, she moved to California in the late 1920s, changed her name to Karen Morley, and pursued an acting career. MGM signed her in 1931, at the beginning of the pre-code era, when films could be daring, provocative, adult in ways they wouldn't be allowed after 1934. Morley had the look that MGM favored: refined, sophisticated, beautiful in a cool, elegant way. But she also had intelligence that came through on screen, a quality that made her more than just another pretty face. She appeared opposite the biggest stars of the era. She was in Scarface with Paul Mooney, playing the society woman who fascinated the gangster. She worked with Greta Garbo, with John Barrymore, with Wallace Beery. These weren't small roles in minor pictures. She was working at the highest level of Hollywood production, in films that would become classics. What set her apart was her willingness to play complicated women. Not villains exactly, but not simple heroines either. She played women with agency, women who made choices, women who weren't just romantic interests for the male lead. In an era when most actresses were confined to narrowly defined roles, Morley managed to find characters with some depth and complexity. She married director Charles Vidor in 1932, adding to her Hollywood credentials. They divorced a few years later, but by then she was established in her own right, a working actress with a solid career. She didn't need to be anyone's wife to get roles. Through the late 1930s and early 1940s, she continued working steadily. But her politics were becoming increasingly progressive. She joined organizations supporting labor rights, civil liberties, anti-fascist causes. Coming from wealth, she could have stayed safely above politics, maintained her privilege, kept her opinions to herself. Instead, she used her platform and her money to support causes she believed in. This made her unusual. Most wealthy people in Hollywood kept their politics vague or conservative. Supporting workers' rights when you came from the management class was considered eccentric at best, suspicious at worst. But Morley seemed genuinely committed to using her privilege for something beyond personal comfort. When HUAC began its investigations, Karen Morley was an obvious target. She'd been too visible, too vocal, too committed to causes that were now being labeled communist. The subpoena came in 1952. She was ordered to appear before the committee and answer questions about her political activities and associations. She took the Fifth Amendment. Again and again, to every question about her beliefs and associations, she refused to answer on grounds that her testimony might incriminate her. She wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't name names, wouldn't perform the ritual of confession and repentance that might have saved her career. Her final film role was in the 1951 remake of M, Fritz Lang's masterpiece about a child murderer. She couldn't have known it would be her last film, that she'd never work in Hollywood again. She was 42 years old, at an age when many actresses were transitioning into character roles, beginning the second act of their careers. Instead, her career simply ended. From 1951 forward, Karen Morley appeared in no films, no television shows, no theater productions. Unlike some blacklisted actors who managed to work under pseudonyms or retreat to Broadway, Morley seemed to withdraw from acting entirely. But she had resources that other blacklisted performers didn't. Her family's wealth, her own savings, and her second marriage to screenwriter Lloyd Gough, himself blacklisted, meant she wouldn't starve. They survived through real estate investments, through careful management of money, through the kind of financial cushion that let them maintain dignity even in unemployment. This privilege meant her blacklist experience was fundamentally different from actors like Art Smith or Lloyd Gough, who had to work odd jobs to survive. Morley could choose to stay blacklisted, could afford to maintain her principles without the desperate financial pressure that broke other people. She used her enforced retirement for political activism. If Hollywood wouldn't let her act, she'd work full-time on the causes that had gotten her blacklisted in the first place. She became deeply involved in civil rights work, peace activism, progressive political campaigns. Her energy went into organizing, fundraising, speaking, all the things she'd done part-time while acting, now her full-time vocation. In interviews decades later, Morley expressed no regrets. She'd chosen principle over career, and she'd lived with the consequences. But she'd also found fulfillment in activism that acting had never provided. The question wasn't whether she'd sacrificed her career, but whether that sacrifice had been worth it. She lived to 93, dying in 2003. By then, the blacklist was history, the Cold War over. The fears that had destroyed careers seeming absurd in retrospect. She'd outlived most of her accusers, most of those who'd cooperated with HUAC, most of the politicians who'd built careers on anti-communist hysteria. In her final years, asked about the blacklist, she was matter-of-fact. She'd made her choice, lived with it, never looked back. The acting career she'd lost seemed less important than the principles she'd maintained. Whether that was genuine peace or necessary rationalization, no one could say. But there was an uncomfortable question her story raised. Did Karen Morley never recover from the blacklist? Or did she simply move on to something she valued more than acting? Is it recovery to find a different life? Or is it just a different kind of loss? For other blacklisted actors who had no choice, who would have returned to acting in an instant if given the chance, Morley's path wasn't available. You needed money to choose principle over career. You needed resources to turn unemployment into political activism. Her story was inspiring in some ways, but it was also a reminder that privilege shapes what's possible even in oppression. The blacklist destroyed her acting career completely. She never made another film, never performed on another stage, never recovered the profession she trained for and succeeded in. But she survived, thrived even, in ways that other blacklisted actors couldn't. That paradox defined her story. Destroyed, but not broken. Unemployed, but not defeated. Silenced as an actress, but loud as an activist. Art Smith was the kind of actor most people never noticed, which was exactly what made him valuable. He wasn't handsome or distinctive or memorable in the way that stars needed to be. He looked like someone's uncle, someone's neighbor, the guy who ran the corner store. He had an ordinary face that could suggest warmth or menace or desperation depending on what the scene required. Born in 1899, he came up through the group theater like so many actors of his generation. He learned the craft seriously, studied with the best teachers, understood acting as more than just a way to make money. By the 1940s, he'd built exactly the kind of career that journeyman character actors aspired to. Steady work, decent pay, the security of knowing that casting directors would think of you when they needed a particular type. He appeared in dozens of films through the 1940s. Small roles mostly, sometimes just a few scenes, but always solid, professional, reliable. He was the kind of actor that directors forgot about until they needed him, then remembered gratefully because he'd show up prepared, hit his marks, deliver his lines without drama or difficulty. His most recognizable role was probably in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, the 1945 film about an Irish-American family struggling through poverty in early 20th century New York. Smith played the father, a dreamer who couldn't hold a job, whose love for his children couldn't compensate for his inability to provide for them. It was a small part in an ensemble piece, but Smith brought genuine pathos to it. You believed in his character's weakness and his love simultaneously. That's what good character actors did. They made you believe in people who only existed on screen for a few minutes. They created complete human beings in limited time, made audiences care about characters who weren't central to the plot. It was craft, skill, years of experience distilled into moments. The Blacklist destroyed Art Smith without drama or ceremony. There was no spectacular confrontation, no testimony before HUAC, no newspaper headlines. His name appeared on lists compiled by private organizations. Someone identified him as having attended meetings, signed petitions, associated with the wrong people. The work simply stopped. 1 month he was employed, getting calls from his agent, showing up on sets. The next month, nothing. The phone didn't ring. His agent stopped submitting him for roles. Casting directors who'd used him for years suddenly had no parts available. He went from working actor to unemployed, and no one would tell him exactly why. He tried to survive through pseudonyms, using fake names to get radio work or small theater jobs. It was humiliating. Being Art Smith meant unemployment, so he became other people, hoped no one would recognize his voice, took whatever scraps of work he could get under assumed identities. The money ran out quickly. Character actors didn't make star salaries. Smith had lived comfortably when he worked, but he'd never been wealthy, had never built the kind of savings that could survive years of unemployment. The Blacklist pushed him into poverty, real, grinding poverty, where you worried about rent and food, where small emergencies became crises. He wasn't famous enough for his unemployment to matter to anyone. When John Garfield died, it made headlines. When Canada Lee died, people noticed. But Art Smith's slow disappearance from the industry went unremarked. He was just another character actor who'd aged out, become irrelevant, stopped getting work. The Blacklist could hide behind natural career decline. In the 1960s, as the Blacklist weakened, he managed to get some television work, small parts on various shows, the kind of one-episode appearances that paid a few $100s. It was better than nothing, but it wasn't a career. He was in his 60s by then. And even if the Blacklist had ended completely, he'd missed the years when he should have been working constantly, building his resume, making the connections that sustain a long career. He died in 1973 at age 73. The obituaries were brief. Variety ran a few paragraphs noting his group theatre background and his film work in the 1940s. No retrospectives, no tributes, no acknowledgement that the industry had destroyed him for political reasons. Just a brief notation that a working actor had died. The kind of death that happens every week in Hollywood without anyone particularly noticing. The cruelty of Art Smith's story was its ordinariness. He wasn't the martyr, wasn't defiant, wasn't someone who chose principle over career in a dramatic gesture. He was just a working actor who got caught in machinery he didn't understand, destroyed for reasons no one clearly explained. Left to survive as best he could, the Blacklist didn't need dramatic confrontations to be effective. It worked just as well, maybe better, through quiet erasure. Art Smith's name disappeared from cast lists, and most people never noticed he was gone. His face disappeared from screens, and audiences didn't demand his return. He became invisible, which for a character actor was a kind of death even before his actual death. What remains of Art Smith? A few film appearances, his name in credits that most people don't read, scattered references in histories of the group theatre. Most people who've seen A Tree Grows in Brooklyn couldn't tell you who played the father. His work survives anonymously, which is perhaps fitting for someone whose career was built on being unnoticed. The Blacklist aimed to erase people completely, to make them disappear so thoroughly that even their absence went unnoticed. With Art Smith, it succeeded perfectly. He didn't die dramatically young, like Garfield or Lee. He didn't make defiant stands like Revere. He just faded away, became poor, struggled through years of unemployment, died forgotten. That was the Blacklist's real power, not the spectacular destructions that made headlines, but the quiet erasures that no one noticed. Art Smith's story is the story of dozens, maybe hundreds of working actors who simply disappeared, their careers destroyed, their names forgotten, their absence unremarked. No one protested when Art Smith stopped working. No one demanded his return. No one noticed he was gone. And that silence was the Blacklist's ultimate victory, not just destroying careers, but making those destructions invisible, unremarkable, unworthy of attention or sympathy, or even basic acknowledgement. The official HUAC hearings called more men than women to testify. The published blacklists contained more male names than female. This wasn't because women were less political or less active in progressive causes. It was because Hollywood treated women's careers as more disposable, easier to eliminate without formal process, simpler to erase without public confrontation. A man called before HUAC made news. His testimony was reported, his cooperation or defiance noted, his fate tracked by industry observers. But a woman could simply stop getting roles, and no one would question it too closely. She'd aged out, people assumed, lost her looks, gotten married, had children. Any number of acceptable explanations existed for why a woman's career ended, explanations that didn't require mentioning politics or blacklists. John Muir's destruction was swift and public, one of the few times a woman's blacklisting made headlines. In August 1950, she was cast in the television series The Aldrich Family as the mother. The show premiered. 3 episodes aired. Then Counterattack published her name, noting her support for various progressive causes in the 1940s. The sponsor, General Foods, panicked. They demanded NBC fire her immediately. NBC complied within days. Jean Muir was out. Another actress was hired to replace her. The show continued as if nothing had happened. Muir's 3 episodes were never rebroadcast. Her work erased. She was 40 years old, a respected stage and film actress. And suddenly, unemployable. She never worked in television again, appeared in only one more film, died in 1996, having spent 46 years in exile from the medium that had destroyed her in 3 days. Marsha Hunt's erasure was quieter, more typical of how the blacklist operated for women. Hunt had been a successful actress in the 1940s, beautiful in a wholesome way that got her cast as the good girl, the faithful wife, the moral center. She'd been politically active, vocally opposed to HUAC's methods, one of the few Hollywood figures willing to publicly defend the Hollywood 10. The roles simply stopped coming. No confrontation, no testimony, no public accusation. Just silence. Her agent couldn't explain why casting directors who'd wanted her before didn't want her now. Studios that had used her regularly suddenly had no appropriate roles. She went from working actress to unemployed without anyone officially acknowledging that she'd been blacklisted. Hunt was never in red channels, never named before HUAC, never formally accused of anything. But everyone in the industry understood she was untouchable. Speaking out against the blacklist was as dangerous as being accused of communism, maybe more dangerous, because at least accused communists could try to clear their names. People who defended them had no path to redemption. She survived through occasional stage work, spent decades in wilderness, finally got television roles again in the 1970s. By then, she was middle-aged, playing mothers and matrons instead of the leading roles she'd lost. She lived to 96, long enough to see the blacklist acknowledged as a shameful period in Hollywood history, but that acknowledgement didn't restore the 25 years of her career that had been taken. Betsy Blair had been married to Gene Kelly, which should have protected her. Kelly was a major star, beloved by audiences, valuable to MGM. When Blair was named in red channels in 1950, Kelly fought for her. He threatened to quit if MGM blacklisted his wife. He used every bit of his influence to keep her working. It worked, barely. Blair wasn't fired immediately, but the roles got smaller, less frequent, less prestigious. MGM made it clear that protecting her was costing Kelly political capital. The marriage survived the blacklist period, but the strain was enormous. Blair eventually moved to Europe, where American blacklists carried less weight, and built a new career there. But she'd been forced into exile, driven from her own country's film industry by political persecution. The wives of blacklisted men suffered doubly. Their husbands lost their careers and income. Many wives were themselves blacklisted by association, unable to work even if they'd never been political themselves. They watched their savings evaporate, their homes lost, their children growing up in poverty. Some wives attended prison visits when their husbands were jailed for contempt of Congress. They sat in stark visiting rooms, separated by glass or wire mesh, trying to maintain family connection while their husbands served time for refusing to name names. Then they went home to figure out how to pay rent, buy food, keep the family functioning while their primary breadwinner was imprisoned for his principles. These women's stories were rarely told. History remembers the men who defied HUAC, the men who went to prison, the men who named names or refused to, the women who supported them, who suffered alongside them, who often sacrificed their own careers They disappeared into footnotes, brief mentions, the assumption that they were simply wives, not artists themselves. But many of these women had been successful in their own right. They'd had careers, talent, prospects. The blacklist destroyed their futures as thoroughly as their husbands, often more so because women's careers in Hollywood were precarious, even without political persecution. The gender dynamics of the blacklist revealed something about how Hollywood valued its workers. Men were worth a public confrontation, a HUAC hearing, a formal accusation. Women could be discarded quietly, their careers ended with a phone call, their talent deemed replaceable. The few women who were publicly blacklisted, Jean Muir, Anne Revere, Gale Sondergaard, were exceptions that proved the rule. Most blacklisted women simply disappeared. They stopped appearing in films, stopped getting cast in television shows, faded from view without headlines or documentation. Decades later, researchers trying to compile complete lists of blacklisted performers struggled to identify all the women whose careers had ended quietly. There were no records, no testimonies, no paper trail, just absence. The unofficial blacklist was often more effective than the official one. If you were called before HUAC, at least you knew why you weren't working. But women who simply stopped getting calls, who never knew if they were officially blacklisted or just quietly dropped, they lived with uncertainty, wondering if they'd done something wrong, if they should try to clear their names, if there was even a name to clear. This uncertainty was its own kind of torture. At least the Hollywood 10 knew they'd been targeted. They could fight, could defend themselves, could make their persecution public. Women who'd just been quietly erased had nothing to fight against. No clear accusation to refute, no way to prove what had happened to them. The women who disappeared, the character actresses, the ingenues, the wives and daughters, they represented the blacklist's most complete victory. Not dramatic destruction, but quiet erasure. Not public punishment, but invisible elimination. They vanished as if they'd never existed, and the industry moved on without acknowledging what it had done. Morris Carnovsky came from Russian Jewish immigrants who'd fled the pogroms, carrying with them a love of culture, theater, the intellectual life that European Jews had cultivated for generations. Born in St. Louis in 1897, Carnovsky grew up understanding that art mattered, that theater was more than entertainment. It was a way of exploring human nature, of asking fundamental questions about how to live. He was a founding member of the group theater in 1931, one of the serious artists who believed that American theater needed to move beyond commercial entertainment into something deeper, more truthful. He studied with the best teachers, learned the techniques that would become method acting, dedicated himself to the craft with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. His true passion was classical theater, especially Shakespeare. He believed that the great roles, Lear, Shylock, Prospero, contained fundamental truths about human nature that modern plays rarely achieved. But classical theater didn't pay enough to survive on. So like many serious actors of his generation, he went to Hollywood for money. Through the 1940s, he worked steadily in films, good roles in quality productions, Our Vines Have Tender Grapes, Dead Reckoning, Rhapsody in Blue. He was a respected character actor the kind of performer that elevated every scene he appeared in. Directors appreciated his professionalism, his deep understanding of character, his ability to find emotional truth even in commercial projects. But Hollywood was never where his heart lived. Films were work, a way to earn a living. Theater was his vocation, his calling, the place where he could practice his art at its highest level. He kept returning to the stage between film jobs, doing Shakespeare whenever possible, maintaining his connection to the work that mattered most to him. When the HUAC subpoena arrived in 1951, Carnovsky knew what it meant. He'd been politically active, had joined organizations, supported causes. He'd never hidden his progressive politics, never pretended to be apolitical to protect his career. Now the bill had come due. He took the Fifth Amendment. Calmly, without dramatics, he refused to answer questions about his political beliefs and associations. He was 54 years old enough to understand exactly what this would cost him, young enough that the loss would matter for decades. His film career ended immediately. From 1951 forward, Maurice Carnovsky appeared in no Hollywood productions for more than 20 years. The steady income disappeared. The comfortable life he'd built through 2 decades of film work evaporated. At 54, he was starting over. But Carnovsky had something that many blacklisted actors didn't, a craft he could practice without Hollywood's permission. He returned to the theater, to the classical roles he'd always loved. The American Shakespeare Festival in Stratford, Connecticut became his sanctuary. They were less concerned with blacklists than Hollywood studios, more committed to artistic excellence than political conformity. At Stratford, Carnovsky played Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. He was magnificent, bringing both the character's rage at anti-Semitic persecution and his human complexity. Critics who saw the performance called it definitive, one of the great Shylocks of the 20th century. He played King Lear in his 70s, that ultimate test of an actor's range and power. He was Prospero in The Tempest, the aging magician preparing to give up his art. These performances were everything Carnovsky had trained for, everything he dreamed of doing. In a strange way, the blacklist had freed him. Without the lure of Hollywood money, without the distraction of film work, he could focus entirely on the classical roles that required years of study, deep understanding of language, the wisdom that comes only with age and experience. But there was a cost beyond the financial. The audiences at Stratford were small compared to film audiences. Millions of people saw his Hollywood films. Thousands saw his Shakespeare performances. His greatest work was witnessed by relatively few people, while his commercial work, competent but not inspired, remained his most widely seen. He taught acting, sharing his group theater training with younger generations. His students revered him, understood they were learning from someone who'd worked with the pioneers of American theater, who'd helped invent method acting, who understood the craft at its deepest level. But teaching, like classical theater, paid modestly. Carnovsky lived simply, without the comfort his Hollywood career would have provided. In the early 1970s, as the blacklist finally weakened, he started getting film offers again. Small roles, brief appearances, nothing that utilized his particular skills. He was in his 70s, too old for the character work he'd done in the 1940s, too classically trained for the naturalistic style that now dominated film acting. He took the work when it came, but it was clear that his film career would never be restored. The Blacklist had cost him 20 years, the years when he should have been transitioning from middle-aged character actor to distinguished elderly performer. By the time Hollywood was willing to hire him again, he was too old. The moment had passed. In interviews late in his life, Carnovsky spoke about the Blacklist with surprising equanimity. He'd lost his film career, yes, but he'd gained something too. The freedom to focus on the work he loved most. The opportunity to play the great roles without distraction. Was that a fair trade? He seemed to think it might be, but there was something defensive in that assessment. A need to frame the loss as gain, the exile as liberation. Perhaps he genuinely felt that way. Or perhaps, after decades, it was easier to focus on what he'd built rather than what had been taken. He died in 1992 at age 94, having worked almost until the end. His obituaries mentioned his Shakespeare performances, his group theatre legacy, his Blacklist Exile, but they struggled to convey the central paradox that the Blacklist had destroyed his most lucrative career while inadvertently enabling his greatest artistic achievements. Did Maurice Carnovsky never recover from the Blacklist? His film career certainly never recovered. He went from successful character actor to 20 years of unemployment to occasional small roles. But his artistic life, his vocation as a classical actor, perhaps reached heights it never would have if Hollywood had kept him busy and comfortable. The question reveals the inadequacy of simple narratives about the Blacklist. Recovery means different things depending on how you define success. If success means money and recognition, Carnovsky never recovered. If success means practicing your art at its highest level, perhaps the Blacklist paradoxically enabled a kind of recovery that would have been impossible otherwise. But that paradox was available only to someone with Carnovsky's specific advantages: classical training, the ability to work in theatre, the stamina to keep performing into his 90s. For actors without those advantages, the Blacklist offered no silver lining, no artistic compensation for economic destruction. Carnovsky's story was exceptional, not representative. The Blacklist took 20 years of his film career and probably millions of dollars in lost income. What it gave back was the chance to play Lear. Whether that was a fair exchange, no one but Carnovsky himself could say. Lloyd Gough had a face and voice that worked perfectly for 1940s cinema. Strong features, a deep resonant voice, the kind of presence that suggested authority, whether he was playing a cop, a criminal, or just an ordinary man caught in extraordinary circumstances. Born in 1907, he'd built his career the hard way, working his way up through small roles, gradually getting noticed, finally achieving the steady employment that character actors aspired to. By the late 1940s, he was working regularly. Not a star, but a reliable supporting player who could be counted on to deliver a solid performance. He appeared in All My Sons, the screen adaptation of Arthur Miller's play, holding his own alongside experienced actors. He was in The Red Pony, working with good directors, quality material. His career was on an upward trajectory, more roles, better parts, increasing recognition within the industry. He was also politically active, never hiding his progressive beliefs, attending meetings and supporting causes that he believed made the world better. When HUAC came for Hollywood, Lloyd Gough's name was on their lists. He'd been too visible, too committed, too unwilling to keep his politics separate from his public life. The subpoena came in the early 1950s. He was called to testify, ordered to answer questions about his political beliefs and associations, pressured to name others who'd attended meetings with him. He refused, not dramatically, not with grand speeches, but firmly and completely. He wouldn't cooperate with what he considered a fundamentally un-American process. His film career ended that day. From a working actor with a growing reputation, he became unemployable overnight. The studios that had valued his work now wouldn't return his calls. His agents stopped submitting him for roles. The industry moved on as if he'd never existed. What followed were decades of survival through whatever work he could find. Gough worked as a building superintendent, managing an apartment building, fixing leaky faucets and broken heaters, collecting rent from tenants. The man who'd appeared on screen opposite established stars was now dealing with clogged drains and tenant complaints. The humiliation would have broken many people. Going from any kind of professional success to manual labor, from being recognized for your talent to being invisible, from creative work to purely functional tasks, that kind of descent destroys people's sense of self, makes them question their worth, their choices, their entire life. But Lloyd Gough remained defiant. In the rare interviews he gave in later years, there was no apology, no regret, no suggestion that he wished he'd cooperated with HUAC. He saw the blacklist as political persecution, not personal failure. He'd been destroyed for refusing to betray his principles, and he wore that destruction as a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. He kept connected to theater when he could, doing small productions, occasional stage work that paid almost nothing but kept him acting. These weren't the roles he would have been playing if the blacklist hadn't happened, weren't the career he'd been building. But they were something, a way of maintaining his identity as an actor even when the industry had rejected him. In the 1970s, when the blacklist had finally weakened enough that even the Defiant could work again, Gough started getting small parts, brief appearances in television shows, minor roles in films, the kind of work any actor could get. He was in his 60s by then, and the parts available to 60-something character actors who'd been blacklisted for 20 years were limited. He took what came without complaint, grateful to work in his profession again, but under no illusions that his career had been restored. The momentum was gone forever. The trajectory that had been building in the late 1940s had been broken, and there was no way to reclaim what might have been. What made Lloyd Gough's story different from other blacklisted actors was his absolute refusal to frame his experience in terms of victimhood. He'd been persecuted, yes. His career had been destroyed, yes. He'd spent decades in poverty doing work far beneath his abilities. But he didn't see himself as defeated. In a late-life interview, asked if he would do anything differently, he said he'd do it all again the same way. The blacklist hadn't broken his spirit, hadn't made him question his choices, hadn't turned principle into regret. He'd paid an enormous price for refusing to cooperate with HUAC, and he considered that price worth paying. This defiance was easier to maintain because Gough had never been a star, never had as far to fall as someone like Revere or John Garfield. He'd been a working character actor, and he became an unemployed character actor, then a building superintendent, then occasionally a working character actor again. The descent was real, but not as spectacular, which perhaps made it easier to bear with dignity. He also benefited from outliving most of his persecutors. By the time he died in 1984 at age 77, the blacklist was widely acknowledged as a shameful period in American history. McCarthyism was a term of derision. CHUAC was defunct. The people who'd named names lived with that knowledge, often expressed regret, sometimes sought forgiveness from those they'd betrayed. Gough had nothing to regret, nothing to apologize for, nothing to feel ashamed about. He'd stood up to political persecution and survived it. That wasn't nothing. But survival isn't the same as recovery. His career never recovered. The work he did in the 1970s and early 1980s was a fraction of what his career would have been without the blacklist. He died largely unknown, his name recognized by few outside those who studied the blacklist period. The films he made in the 1940s remain evidence of what he might have become if fear hadn't made integrity a crime. In those performances, you can see an actor hitting his stride, developing his craft, building towards something, then nothing, 20 years of silence, then small parts that couldn't utilize what he'd learned, couldn't build on what he'd achieved. Lloyd Gough's story was about the cost of defiance, not just economic cost, but the cost of lost potential, unmade art, a career that might have been. He paid that cost willingly, consciously, without regret. Whether that made it better or worse, no one could say. What remains is the image of an old man, still defiant, still political, still convinced that some things matter more than career or comfort or success. The blacklist tried to make an example of people like Lloyd Gough. See what happens when you don't cooperate, when you put principle over pragmatism. But Gough refused to be the example they wanted. He wouldn't be broken, wouldn't recant, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of destroying his spirit along with his career. The blacklist took everything he'd built, but it couldn't take his sense of self, his belief that he'd done the right thing. In the end, that was both victory and defeat. Victory because they hadn't broken him. Defeat because his unbroken spirit didn't restore his career, didn't undo the damage, didn't give back the decades they'd taken. He stood defiant in the ruins of what might have been, and whether that was triumph or tragedy depended on how you measured a life. Hollywood moved on quickly. By the early 1960s, the blacklist was weakening. Some of the blacklisted were working again, often under pseudonyms, sometimes openly. The fear that had gripped the industry for a decade was loosening its hold. Americans had new concerns, new enemies, new panics. The Cold War continued, but domestic anti-communism had lost its fever pitch. The industry never formally acknowledged what it had done. There was no official apology, no compensation fund for destroyed careers, no reckoning with the lives ruined and the art unmade. The studios that had implemented the blacklist simply stopped enforcing it as quietly as they'd begun. People who'd been unemployable started working again, and everyone pretended this was natural, rather than a reversal of policy. In 1997, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences held a ceremony acknowledging the blacklisted writers. 50 years after the blacklist began, Hollywood's most prestigious organization finally admitted that maybe, possibly, blacklisting talented people for their political beliefs had been wrong. The ceremony honored the writers who'd worked under pseudonyms, whose Oscar-winning scripts had been credited to fronts, whose careers had been destroyed or damaged. But the ceremony honored writers, not actors. The Hollywood 10 were writers and directors. The pseudonymous Oscar winners were writers. Actors couldn't hide behind fake names, couldn't work anonymously, couldn't separate their physical presence from their work. Their destruction had been more complete and more visible. Yet the formal acknowledgement focused on those who'd managed to keep working secretly. 2 years later, in 1999, the Academy gave Elia Kazan an honorary Oscar for Lifetime Achievement. Kazan, who'd named 8 people before HUAC, destroying their careers to save his own. Kazan, who'd continued making masterpieces while those he'd named disappeared into obscurity. Half the audience refused to applaud when he accepted his award. The other half gave him a standing ovation. That moment crystallized Hollywood's relationship with its blacklist past, deeply divided, unable to agree even on basic moral questions, more comfortable with ambiguity than accountability. Kazan made great films. Kazan also ruined lives. Both things were true, and Hollywood couldn't decide which mattered more. The actors who'd been blacklisted received no equivalent ceremony, no formal recognition of what had been done to them. Some had died decades earlier: Garfield, Lee, Christians. Their deaths accelerated by the stress of unemployment and persecution. Others had survived into old age, outliving their persecutors, but never recovering their careers. Revere got some work in the 1970s, but died without ever receiving an apology from the industry that had discarded her despite her Oscar. Gale Sondergaard lived to see the blacklist acknowledged as shameful, but never saw her own erasure specifically addressed. Jeff Corey became more famous for teaching than for his acting, his actual career subsumed by what he'd done in Exile. The children and grandchildren of blacklisted performers still process the trauma. They grew up with parents or grandparents who carried the weight of destroyed careers, lost opportunities, decades of wondering what might have been. Some became activists themselves, fighting against contemporary forms of political persecution. Others avoided politics entirely, having seen what it cost their families. The films that were never made represent an incalculable loss. What would John Garfield have done in his 40s and 50s if he'd lived, if he'd kept working? What roles would Canada Lee have originated? What barriers would he have broken? How many great performances were lost because talented actors spent their prime years unemployed or working under pseudonyms? The blacklist lasted roughly from 1947 to the mid-1960s, though its effects lingered longer. During those years, approximately 300 people were formally blacklisted, unable to work in their professions. Thousands more were affected indirectly: spouses, children, colleagues who wouldn't hire the blacklisted for fear of being tainted themselves. The mathematics of loss is staggering. 300 careers disrupted or destroyed. Call it an average of 10 films per person they would have made during the Blacklist years. That's 3,000 performances that never happened. 3,000 roles that went to other actors or simply weren't filled. Multiply by the number of people who might have seen those performances, been moved by them, remembered them. The cultural loss is immeasurable. Modern discussions of cancel culture, of political litmus tests for employment, of social media mobs destroying careers. These conversations happen without most participants understanding that we've been here before. The Blacklist was the original cancel culture, implemented not by Twitter mobs, but by government committees and private organizations, enforced not through social pressure, but through coordinated economic destruction. What Hollywood learned from the Blacklist, if anything, is unclear. The industry still responds to political pressure, still makes decisions based on fear of boycotts, still values commercial success over principle. The mechanisms are different now, but the fundamental cowardice remains. The willingness to sacrifice individuals to protect the collective, to destroy careers rather than defend them, to prioritize safety over justice. The preserved testimony from HUAC hearings remains available. Scratchy footage of actors and writers answering questions, taking the fifth, trying to thread impossible needles. Watching them now, knowing how their lives would unfold, is almost unbearable. You want to reach through time and warn them, tell them to run, tell them nothing they say will matter, that the machinery of destruction is already in motion. But they couldn't run. Where would they go? This was their home, their industry, their livelihood. They had to stay and face what was coming, had to watch their careers destroyed, had to survive as best they could in the ruins. What remains now is mostly silence. The blacklisted actors are nearly all dead. Their films survive. You can still watch John Garfield burn with intensity, Canada Lee command the screen, Anne Revere bring dignity to maternal roles. But the films they would have made in the 1950s and 60s, the performances they would have given in their mature years, those are gone forever. The studio gates still stand in Los Angeles. The sound stages where blacklisted actors were turned away still operate, producing films and television shows for new generations. The industry has changed in countless ways: technology, economics, culture. But in some fundamental sense, it remains the same. Still driven by fear, still willing to sacrifice individuals, still capable of destroying careers when politics demands it. The question the blacklist poses isn't primarily about the past. It's about the present and future. In a moment of collective fear, what are you willing to lose? What will you sacrifice to keep working? When politics and principle collide, which matters more? The blacklisted actors answered those questions with their lives. Some broke, named names, kept working. Some held firm, lost everything, survived with dignity. Some died young, bodies destroyed by stress. Some lived long enough to see vindication, though vindication couldn't restore what they'd lost. Their answers cost them careers, comfort, sometimes life itself. But those answers are on record now, preserved in testimony and in absence, in the films they made and the films they couldn't make. When the fear comes, and it always comes again, just in different forms, their answers remind us what principle costs and what it might be worth The industry forgot them, but history shouldn't. Not because they were heroes. Many were just ordinary people caught in machinery they didn't understand. But because their destruction was a choice, not an accident. Hollywood chose fear over courage, chose safety over justice, chose to destroy careers rather than defend them. And the industry never paid a price for that choice, never faced consequences, never even had to apologize properly. It just moved on, made new films, found new stars, pretended the destroyed lives didn't matter. That forgetting is the Blacklist's final victory. Not the careers destroyed, but the ease with which those destructions were absorbed and forgotten, as if they'd never happened, as if those lives and careers had never mattered at all.